the things electronically and sends an email to whatever. I'll tell you about that, Francois, don't worry. They have to also sign a hard copy and send it to the Bureau des Études. I have all the information.
Okay. So can we start now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Is it 45 minutes, the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so welcome everybody. I don't know who. Anyway, so Eugenia, you have 45 minutes to present your work and for questions afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will start. I will just move some windows here and there. And here we go. So hello everyone. Today in these slightly unusual circumstances, I would like to present you the main results of my PhD thesis entitled Knowledge Representation and Curation in Hierarchies of Graphs. So this thesis was done in LEAP in the team Plume under the supervision of Russ Harmer. So I would like to start my presentation by giving you a global, slightly philosophical motivation behind the work we do together with Russ. Modern technologies generate a great abundance of data, from records of human activity and behavior, measurements of weather, measurements of systems that operate on microscopic levels, such as protein-protein interactions of gene expression. And modern scientists struggle on extracting implicit knowledge from these abundant raw data, on getting insights on the mechanisms that drive the system that we want to study. And getting these insights is not only necessary to deepen our understanding of the systems, but also to develop new technologies, to build drugs, to predict future behaviors. And such extraction greatly relies on the design of automatized tools for processing and analysis of data, and for querying, automatized reasoning, extraction, and mining of patterns. And often extracting this implicit knowledge means building computational models that can be executed to study the dynamics of these underlying systems. And again, to make predictions of future behaviors of this system, to discover some macroscopic phenomena that emerge from the behavior of these systems, and also to study the causality of events that appear during the evolution of our systems. So, however, even our explicit knowledge, even our raw data, is often represented in the form that is not suitable for automatized processing by a machine. For example, a great portion of knowledge about protein-protein interaction is represented in the form of natural language, of journal articles. And also, this knowledge is often fragmentary, dispersed over multiple sources, stored in different formats, also often even inconsistent. For example, corresponds to the result of different experimental techniques. Therefore, there is a need for adequate machine-readable knowledge representation and for some automatized tools for knowledge curation. And by curation in my thesis, I mean the dynamical process of integration, annotation, and revision of some domain-specific knowledge. So in this thesis, we make an effort to design a framework for representation and curation of knowledge on complex systems that is based on the structure that we call hierarchy of graphs. And this hierarchy of graphs will be the main focus of my talk today. And we would like this framework to allow us to represent fragmentary knowledge on potentially different abstraction levels, to relate different knowledge fragments, to update individual knowledge fragments while preserving the consistent relations between them. And finally, we wanted to allow us to maintain the history of knowledge updates, as well as multiple versions of our knowledge corpora. So, alongside with the theoretical framework for knowledge representation and curation that we have developed two major applications. So the first application tackles the problem in the community of graph databases, and it proposes a model for data schema coevolution. The second application addresses a problem in computational biology and proposes a framework for curation of biological knowledge on cellular signaling. And we also developed three software tools, so the regraph Python library that implements our general purpose knowledge representation and curation framework, then the Kami library that proposes this biocuration framework for cellular signaling, and finally Kami Studio, a standalone tool, so the environment for Kami for biocuration. So let me proceed to the main part of my talk. Let me introduce you hierarchies of graphs that form the base of our framework. And to be slightly complementary to my manuscript, I would like to make this presentation rather high level and present you rather intuitive ideas behind our framework and not go into a lot of technical details that can be found in the manuscript. So let us recall the statement I made in the introductory part. So what we want to build a system for knowledge representation that allows us to. So it would allow us to represent knowledge on complex systems. So we want to be able to efficiently represent knowledge on entities and relationships. We want to be able to equip entities and relationships with attributes that could be used, for example, to represent internal state, properties of entities and relationships. We want to be able to divide our knowledge corpus into distinct knowledge fragments. And finally, we want to relate entities and relationships from different fragments in some consistent way. So how do we do that? So we use the natural model of graphs to represent entities and relationships. Then we equip nodes and edges of our graphs with dictionary attributes that would represent these internal states or properties. And then we divide our knowledge corpus simply using different graphs, and we relate knowledge from different graphs using graph homomorphisms, so functional maps from nodes and edges of one graph to another graph. And therefore, the main structure of our interest is a hierarchy of graphs. So what we would also like to be able to do is to have some kind of an infrastructure for curation of knowledge. So we would like to have some rigorous mechanism that would allow us to update individual fragments and keep and preserve the consistency and structure of our hierarchies. We also would like to be able to accommodate a traceable history of knowledge updates and also have some efficient way to store multiple versions of our knowledge corpus. So we adopt the techniques from graph rewriting for graph transformations, and we design mechanisms for propagation of graph transformations along the homomorphisms. And we also build an audit trail system that operates on our main structure of interest, so on graph hierarchy. So let us introduce what is a graph hierarchy. A graph hierarchy is a simply directed acyclic graph whose nodes are graphs, whose edges are graph homomorphisms, such that all paths from the same source graph to the same target graph are equal. So let us briefly recall what are graph homomorphisms. So graph homomorphisms are simply functional maps that map nodes and edges of one graph to another that preserve the edges consistently. So an edge in the source graph maps to the edge in the target graph between the images of the source nodes. And now I have mentioned that we would like to equip our graphs with attributes. So we want to assign some dictionary structures to nodes and edges. And if we do so, we need to slightly modify our definition of homomorphism. So we additionally require for attributes to be preserved. So we require that the source graph element, like node and edge, the attributes of the source element is a subdictionary of the attributes of the target element. So let us see a couple of small examples of graph hierarchies. So the first and the most elementary example is often called typed graph in the community, and it's given by two graphs, graph G typed by graph T, and graph T on the bottom defines kinds of nodes and edges that can exist in graph G. So in this example, we have circular and square node, and now graph G has multiple instances of these circular and square nodes, and has only edges that are allowed by our typing graph T. Now the second and slightly more elaborated example consists of three graphs. So here we have graph G typed by graph T, graph G typed by graph S, who is also typed by graph T. And in this case, in this example, we have the same graph T that defines circles and squares. Now graph S slightly refines this typing and defines two kinds of circles and squares, orange and blue. And now our graph G has multiple instances of these orange and blue circles and squares. So now this is the first and the most elementary example where our consistency condition plays an important role. So it guarantees that the direct typing of G by T is consistent with the same typing that factors through S. So in the context of knowledge representation, it means that moving along alternative paths from a concrete to a more abstract representation of knowledge, we get a consistent picture. And now, if we use the language of category theory, it allows us to see our hierarchies as large commutative diagrams. So So how do we update knowledge represented with hierarchies of graphs? So we use Sesky push-out rewriting approach, and to do so, to use this approach, we need to reformulate hierarchies using the language of category theory. So we operate on several categories of graphs. So we consider simple graphs where only one edge between a pair of nodes is allowed, or non-simple graphs where multiple such edges are allowed. Then we also consider categories of graphs equipped with attributes, whose nodes and edges are equipped with these dictionary structures. And we build our framework on the classical notions in the category theory, such as push-out, pullback, final pullback complement, image factorization. Now, some of you may be already familiar with these notions, some of you may not, but today I will not introduce them in details. They can be found in my manuscript, and I will try to explain our framework, not going into technical mathematical details. So let us briefly recall what is a Sesky push-out rewriting approach. How can we transform graphs using this approach? So a transformation of a graph is given by a rule that forms a span, so that it consists of three objects, three graphs in our case, L, P, and R. Graph L is often called a pattern. It's the left-hand side of the rule that is matched inside of our target graph through a monomorphism, so through an injective map of nodes and edges. And in this small example on the right, you can see a rule, and the left-hand side is mapped in our target graph and highlighted with orange. Now, we can apply the Sesky push-out rewriting rule in two phases. The first phase we call a restrictive phase, and this phase performs deletion and cloning of different graph elements. And for those of you who are familiar with category theory, it's given by the final pullback complement. Now, on this small example, our rule clones two circular nodes and removes a squared node on the bottom. Now, the second phase of rewriting we call the expansive phase, and it performs the addition and merging of different graph elements, and is given by a push-out. So in our example, I merged triangular and squared node, I add a new diamond node and connect it to this merge node. And the result of my rewriting I can see on the bottom right. Now, the question of our interest is how can we take this technique, this Sesky push-out rewriting, and update objects situated in the hierarchies of graphs in such a way that would preserve the structure and the consistency of our hierarchy. And to understand how we tackle this problem, let us consider a small example of a chain hierarchy. So this hierarchy consists of three objects, graph H typed by graph G typed by graph T, and we want to rewrite a graph G situated in the middle. So if we perform a restrictive phase of rewriting, so we remove and we clone some graph elements, we observe that the result of rewriting graph G minus stays typed by our original typing graph T. However, to restore the edge that corresponded to the homomorphism from H to G, we may need to update the graph H itself and perform something that we call a backward propagation. Now, on the other hand, when we perform an expansive rewrite of our graph in the middle, so we add and merge some graph elements, we observe that the graph H that was typed by graph G stays typed by the result of rewriting. And now we need to restore an edge that corresponded to a homomorphism from G to T. And for this, we may need to update our object T and perform something that we call forward propagation. So let us look into details what is a backward propagation. So backward propagation is defined given a hierarchy H from H to G, as in the previous example, and the restrictive rewrite of G. So rewrite that performs removal and cloning of graph elements. So if we remove elements in G, we propagate these changes to H. So the removal of types induces the removal of all the instances of these types in H, because graph G was typed in graph H. Now, if we clone elements in G, we have some freedom of choice, so we can implement multiple scenarios of backward propagation. First such scenario we call a canonical propagation, and in this scenario we clone every instance of a clone type. So in this example on the right, I take graph G and I select a circular node and I clone it into two semicircles. And then as a result of my canonical backward propagation, I clone each instance of a circle. So I produce two semicircles for orange and two semicircles for blue circle. Now I can perform no propagation to H, and what I can do is simply specify how to retype the instances of cloned elements by these produced clones. So in this example, I simply specify that my orange instance becomes a left semicircle and the blue instance becomes a right semicircle. Yes. And now what I can also do is combine both scenarios. For some instances, I can specify a retyping, and some instances I can clone. In this example, I specify that orange instance is a left semicircle and the blue instance is cloned. So intuitively, our backward propagation allows us to clean up instances of removed elements, removed element types, and allows us to specify how do we perform the cloning of instances. So now forward propagation is defined given a hierarchy H from G to T, as in our previous example, and an expansive rewrite of G. So we add and we merge some elements in G. Now, if we merge two elements of different types in G, we are obliged to merge their respective types in T to preserve the functionality of our homomorphism that relate G and T. Now, if we add new elements in G, we have again multiple scenarios. And the first such scenario, again, we call a canonical propagation scenario. So for every new element in G, we add a new corresponding type in T. In this small example on the right, I add in two circles, blue and green, and I add the new types for this circle. So I have new types of blue and green circle. Now, another scenario we call this scenario where no propagation happens. So we use existing elements in T to retype the new elements in G. In this case, I simply specify that my blue and green circle are instances of a circle that already exists in T. And finally, again, I can combine both scenarios. So I can, here in this example, I can specify that my blue circle is an instance of already existing circle, and for green circle, I add a new type. So intuitively, our forward propagation allows us to merge types when necessary and allows us to control the addition of new element types, which means it allows us to control how the new concepts and new types are aggregated in our typing graphs. So now, having combined these two techniques of backward and forward propagation, we design a mechanism for the update of graphs situated in arbitrary hierarchies. So in this schematic example, I show some graph hierarchy. So every node here represents a graph, every edge here represents a graph homomorphism, and I would like to rewrite a graph situated in the very center of this hierarchy. So first thing I do is I perform a restrictive rewrite. So I remove and clone graph elements. Then I perform backward propagation to all the ancestor graphs in the hierarchy. So I specify how to clone the instances, I clean up the instances of removed types. Then I perform an expansive rewrite of our target graph. So I add and merge elements. And then I perform a forward propagation to all the descendant graphs in our hierarchy. I specify how to add new types and merge types when necessary. And on the final step of this propagation procedure, I restore the homomorphisms from and to updated objects. And this can be done automatically when certain composability conditions are satisfied. And in my thesis, I formulate these conditions. And in this talk, I will not give you any details, but what I would like to mention is that these conditions are highly local, so they operate on the pairs of objects related with homomorphisms. So they are not imposed globally on the entire hierarchy. So now we have shown you some procedure for updating one object situated in the hierarchy and propagating this change, this transformation of our knowledge to all the related levels, to all the related graphs. Now what we also would like to do is to design some audit trail system that would allow us to record the history of our hierarchy updates. We would also like to be able to roll back, so to perform a rollback operation that would bring us back to the old version of our hierarchy. And finally, what we would like to do is to maintain multiple versions of the hierarchy. So starting from one hierarchy, we can perform a sequence of parallel changes, so conflicting changes, and we would like to store these final results, these two branching versions. And this is particularly useful when multiple collaborators work on the same knowledge corpus. And this is very similar to the idea of branching in version control systems as Git used in software development. So how do we do that? So the first question that we need to answer is how do we store our history of updates? So storing the state of our hierarchy at each update step is not feasible. For example, when our hierarchies represent very large knowledge corpora. So we need to design some efficient way to represent transformations in the hierarchy. Now, let us recall that given some rewriting of a single object in a hierarchy, we were able to obtain an entire hierarchy of transformations. So in this example, I draw empty circles to represent these updates to all the objects in the hierarchy. Our green circles represent the backward propagation, orange circles represent forward propagation, and with gray circles I denote the objects of identity transformations, the objects that were not affected by this propagation. So what I can extract is a hierarchy of rules that encodes the rewriting and propagation in our hierarchy. So what is the hierarchy of rules? Hierarchy of rules, similarly to a hierarchy of graphs, is a directed acyclic graph whose nodes are rules, whose edges are rule homomorphisms that satisfy the consistency condition I have previously introduced. So how do we define rule homomorphisms in this context? So for Sasky-Pouchout rewriting rules given by the spans, we define rule homomorphisms by triples of homomorphisms that satisfy certain additional consistency conditions that make the diagram in this slide compute. So let us see a small example of a rule hierarchy. So I have a hierarchy of graphs from the previous example. I have graph G typed by graph S typed by graph T, and I update graph S. So I select an orange circle, I clone it into two semicircles, left and right, and I add a new triangular node to this graph. Then I perform a backward propagation, and I can express this backward propagation also as a Sasky-Pouchout rewriting rule. And in this case, my Sasky-Pouchout rewriting rule that represents backward propagation selects the instances of the orange circle and specifies how do I want to perform backward propagation. So here I retype one instance by a left circle and I clone the second instance. Now I can also perform forward propagation and again express it as a rule. And this rule selects a circular node and adds a new type, a new node, a triangle that types the new blue triangle in the graph S. So what I obtain is a hierarchy of rules that has the same shape, so is defined over the same skeleton as our original hierarchy. And I can rewrite hierarchy by simply applying these rules to each of the objects, and I can restore the homomorphisms. So now I can construct my audit trail by simply storing the rule hierarchies that represent our transformations in the hierarchy. And why is it more efficient than storing the hierarchy itself? Simply because our transformations typically represent highly localized changes in some small graph patterns, and they do not represent the entire change in the hierarchy. So now our question is, having stored our hierarchy updates using rule hierarchies, how can we roll back to an old version, and can we do it? So, and the answer to this question is not always. And the reason why are the side effects that Sasky-Pouchout rewriting introduces. It is well known in the community of graph transformation that Sasky-Pouchout rewriting introduces some side effects on graphs. So for example, removal of a node induces the removal of all the incident edges, independent whether these edges are selected by the rule, mentioned in the rule or not. But what we have also discovered is that this rewriting has a side effect on homomorphisms in the hierarchy. And to show you what are these side effects, consider the following example. So here I have a hierarchy consisting of graph G typed by graph T. Graph T specifies two types of nodes, orange and blue circle. Graph G has two instances of orange, one instance of blue. And I select by my rule, that is just expansive rule, just adds and merges things. I select one instance of orange and one instance of blue, and I merge them. Now I perform a forward propagation, as the result of which I merge the type. So I merge orange and blue type in T. And now what I highlight in this figure with orange is the instance of orange circle that was not selected by the rule, that was not mentioned in the rule above. And this instance, as a side effect of our forward propagation, becomes typed by the merged node. And now if I want to undo this change, I want to apply this rule in the reversed order, I cannot restore my homomorphism. So I lose the information on whether our unaffected, so instant that was not mentioned by the rule, it was blue or orange. So I lose some information. Therefore, to be able to perform the operation of a rollback in our audit trail, we require the rewriting and propagation in hierarchies to be reversible. And we formulate this reversibility for rewriting with hierarchies of graphs in the manuscript. So now, if all the transformations in our audit trail are reversible, we can simply roll back by applying our rule hierarchies backwards. And we come back to the old version. Now, what we can also do to be able to perform the rollback is take a sequence of our rule hierarchies that represented our history of updates and compose them. Produce some kind of composed rule hierarchy that performs all the updates at once. So, and immediately comes back to the old version of our hierarchy. And this composition is often called concurrent synthesis in the community. So, because it simply performs all the updates concurrently, all at the same time. And we formulate how concurrent synthesis of rule hierarchies can be performed. We formulate it in our manuscript. And so we also use this technique to maintain multiple versions of the hierarchy. So how do we do that? So we use an idea from a version control system, an idea of delta compression. So to store two different versions, we simply store one version and we store the delta. So the differences from this version to the other versions. And in this small example, imagine that I have two versions of the same hierarchy. And let's say my delta represents some identity hierarchy, some identity transformation, because these versions are not yet diverged. They represent the same hierarchy. And now I update one of the versions. And what I do, I can express this update as a rule hierarchy, and I update my delta by composing the previous delta with the with the rule hierarchy that represented my update. And this technique allows me to accumulate the changes that represent this divergence of two versions. So I think it's time to conclude the main part of my talk. So we have introduced the structure of hierarchy of graphs that is very suitable structure to represent the fragmented knowledge on potentially different abstraction levels. We have designed the mechanisms for rewriting and propagation of graphs situated in the hierarchy. And we have also introduced the notion of a rule hierarchy, by which we have generalized the Sesquipouchat rewriting from objects to hierarchies of objects. And we have also studied for rule hierarchies the question of reversibility and composition, so our concurrent synthesis. And this allowed us to develop a system for storing an audit trail, for storing the history of updates in hierarchies of graphs, for storing multiple versions, for performing typical operations of version control, so operations of rollback, merging, and etc. So we have also implemented our framework in our Python library regraph. So this library allows the user to build graphs, hierarchies of graphs, rewrite them, and it supports two backends. So user can create graphs and graph hierarchies using in-memory graphs, or user can create them using the persistent property graphs given by the Neo4j database. And also this code is available freely online in this GitHub repository. So let me proceed to the first application of our framework, namely the design of schemas for property graphs. So what is a property graph data model? Property graph data model underlies the majority of modern graph databases. It is a very simple model that says that we can store our data as a graph, as a set of nodes and edges. And moreover, we can also equip nodes and edges with some internal structure of properties that are similar to our attributes. They are given by the dictionaries and can be used to represent some properties or states of the entities we want to store in this database. Moreover, this model allows us to assign labels on the nodes and edges of our graphs. And such labeling allows us to split the nodes and edges into separate sets that are often interpreted as types. So looking at the sets of labels of nodes and edges, we can have some idea of the shape of our data. So which kind of nodes, which kinds of edges we have in our database. And this gives us a sort of prescriptive schema, sort of descriptive schema, so a schema that reflects the shape of data. However, in the classical notion of schema that originates from relational databases is prescriptive, in a sense that it does not only reflect the shape of data, it also forces the data to respect this shape. And because property graphs data model does not provide these capabilities of prescriptive schemas, this data model is often called a schema-free. So we don't have any means to specify these prescriptive schemas. And these prescriptive schemas, in the case of relational databases, can be used to say that which kind of columns our tables have, which data types these columns have. So what we would like to do in our application is to design specifications for schemas, for prescriptive schemas for property graphs. And we want to adopt our Sesquipouchat rewriting semantics to update property graphs. And we exploit our mechanism of forward and backward propagation to design schema data coevolution techniques. So what is a schema-aware property graph? Schema-aware property graph can be defined simply as a two-level hierarchy consisting of two graphs, data graph and a schema graph, both being property graphs, and data is homomorphic to our schema. So our homomorphism expresses naturally the notion of a type. So our schema defines the types of nodes, types of edges, sets of allowed properties that our entities can have. And in this little figure, I have a little schema that defines two types of nodes, person and message. I have some types of edges, and I encode my homomorphism with colors in the data graph. So now, in the context of databases, we are often interested in two scenarios of data schema coevolution. And the first such scenario we call descriptive updates. So these are the updates that are performed in the data and are propagated to schema. This scenario is particularly common when we operate on not yet mature schema. So our schema needs to be gradually, incrementally built up upon the arrival of new data instances. And in this small example, I apply some rules. So I transform my data graph, I select two existing nodes, and I add a new node denoted with purple to the graph. Moreover, I add a new property city to one of the existing nodes. And now I have rewritten my data, and I would like to keep my data compliant to schema. So I want to keep my data graph homomorphic to schema, and I want to perform a forward propagation. So first, I observe that I know the types of existing elements. Now what I observe also that one of the existing elements has a new property that is not allowed by the set of properties of the message. So in this example, I add a new property city, and it's not in the set of allowed properties of the message. Now, as a forward propagation, I add a new concept to my schema. So I add a new type check-in, and I call it check-in, and I augment a set of properties of message. So I add a city to the set of allowed properties. And this way, I can gradually aggregate new concept and new properties in my schema until the schema becomes mature. And when the schema is more mature, we are interested in the second scenario of schema data coevolution that we call prescriptive updates. So these are the updates that are performed in the schema and are propagated to our data. In this example, I perform something that is called concept refinement. So I select an existing concept message from my schema, and I clone it, I refine it into two more fine-grained concepts of post and comment. So I perform this update in my schema, and now I would like to update my data. So I would like to perform backward propagation and keep my data compliant with the schema. And in this example, I observe that my message instances have some property that can indicate whether they are post or comment. So I use these properties to specify the retyping of some of the instances. But I observed that one of the instances does not have, so it happened that it does not have the property type, so I cannot decide whether it's post or comment. So as a result of my backward propagation, I produce two instances, one for post, one for comment, and this way I avoid losing the loss of data. So I perform the cloning of this instance, of this unknown instance. So in the conclusion of this section, we have proposed a model for schema-aware property graphs, where schemas can be seen as property graphs themselves, and the relation between data and schema can be expressed naturally using the notion of a graph homomorphism. And this expressing this relation as a homomorphism allows us to use our techniques from graph rewriting and to perform this data schema coevolution, as the result of which we can keep our data compliant with schema at all times. We have also built a prototype system of these schema-aware property graphs in the Neo4j database, and they are implemented as a part of our regraph library. So I would like to proceed to the third part of my presentation. I would like to present you the second application of our framework to the biocuration of cellular signaling. So let us see, what is cellular signaling? Cellular signaling is a mechanism through which cells communicate with the environment and between themselves. So this cellular signaling underlies the most essential processes in the living cell, from the response to environment, change of their internal states, to their proliferation and death, and it emerges as the result of thousands of protein-protein interactions that happen concurrently and that form complex functional networks. And the complexity of these systems makes them very hard to model them. And this modeling challenge arises not only on the stage of model, on the simulation, analysis, it also arises on the stage of model building. So the amount of agent species that take part in these interactions that form cellular signaling is so astronomical that the model becomes simply impossible to write down. Moreover, these models are needed to be, they need to be incremented gradually. So this model should be updated on the arrival of new knowledge about protein-protein interactions. So there is a need for an intermediate tool that would allow biologists to curate knowledge, to curate the incoming knowledge, to change the existing knowledge and its interpretation, and to automatically build dynamical models of signaling from this knowledge. So we propose a biocuration framework that is based on our knowledge representation system that allows the biologists to aggregate individual protein-protein interactions into some coherent corpora, to instantiate the knowledge present in the corpora into different cellular contexts, for example, different cell types, mutant or wild-type cells, etc. And finally, it allows the biologists to automatically generate executable models directly from the knowledge. So in this schematic example, you can see the pipeline of CAMI. So the individual protein-protein interactions, PPIs, are fed to the aggregation engine that assembles them in a coherent corpus. So this corpus represents, it contains some kind of a global roadmap of all the entities and interactions that are known to the system. Then we use the definitions of different protein variants in different cellular contexts, for example, different splice variants, mutant variants, to instantiate, to reuse the knowledge present in the corpus for generation of different concrete models. So in this small example, I show some models, let's say, for muscle cells, blood cells, and neurons. And then these models can be directly converted to executable models, to rule-based models, or ODEs, when ordinary differential equations, when it's feasible. So the representation, knowledge representation system of CAMI represents the protein-protein interactions with small graphs that are typed by a graph that we call action graph. So this action graph defines all kinds of entities and actions and their structural elements that are already known to the system. And it gives us this global roadmap that I have mentioned previously. And this mapping of this typing of nuggets by the action graph allows us to identify different entities and actions mentioned in the individual protein-protein interactions. So in this example, our first nugget on the left, the main agents of the interaction described by this nugget are actually the instance of the same type of the agent, some product of the EGFR gene. And in the second example, for example, two green nodes map to the same binding action. So they are identified as the same interaction mechanism. I will explain you in more detail how we exploit this identification. So now the nodes of, you see the colors of nodes of nuggets and the action graph, they encode the mapping they are typing by the little graph, little hardwired graph that we call the meta model. So the meta model defines the syntaxes for our knowledge. So it defines which kinds of entities we can represent. So we can represent different kinds of interactions like modification and binding, different structural elements of proteins, regions, residues, their states. And as you may notice, the main, so this light blue node, the main agent of interaction in CAMI, is called a protoform. So it's not a protein, it's a protoform. So the protoform represents a neighborhood in the space of all protein products that that one gene can give rise to. And therefore, the representation, knowledge representation used in CAMI is decontextualized. So the nuggets encode not protein-protein interactions, they encode potential protein-protein interactions and the necessary conditions for these interactions to happen. So this interaction can happen or not, depending on whether the products satisfy some necessary conditions specified in the nuggets. And we can see a small example in a second. So under the hood, the CAMI operates on a graph hierarchy. So our corpus is actually a graph hierarchy that has the following shape. The left branch of this hierarchy gives these knowledge components that I have presented. So a collection of nuggets typed by the action graph, typed by the meta model. And the rest of the graphs represent some built-in knowledge, some background knowledge that we use for our aggregation and instantiation processes. And today I will not give you details on these background components, but you can find more details in the manuscript. So let us finalize this third part of my talk by giving you a small example of how we use backward and forward propagation to perform the aggregation and instantiation of knowledge in CAMI. So in this example, we can see a small action graph. So our roadmap that defines the three kinds of entities. We have three kinds of protoforms that are given by genes EGFR, SHIC, and GRAB, some structural elements, some actions that they can perform. And imagine that on the input of our system, we get some new protein interaction that defines, so it's a little nugget that encodes the interaction of AXL that binds to GRAB. And now, to add this new knowledge, to aggregate this knowledge into our corpus, we identify the entities that already exist in the system, that are already known by the system. In this case, we already know SH2 domain and GRAB, and we perform a forward propagation that adds the new bits of not yet known knowledge to our action graph. And as a result, for example, I was not able to identify the green node, so the binding action of our interaction of AXL with GRAB, of our new input interaction. So I have two different binding nodes attached to the SH2 domain of GRAB. And in general, identification of actions is not possible because there doesn't exist some grounding, such as this grounding for genes and different gene regions, for example, different databases as UniProt, Interpro. We can never identify the interaction mechanism. However, this identification is very important on the stage of model generation. So in this case, we use the background knowledge that is already encoded in the hierarchy of Kami, and we identify that SH2 domain is a conserved protein domain that has exactly one interaction mechanism through which it can bind. And so we perform another extra update that we call a semantic update, and we merge the action of the SH2 domain. So now, as a side effect of such a merge, all the nuggets whose actions, whose green squared nodes map to this merge node, they will represent the instances of the same interaction mechanism of SH2 domain of GRAB. And it has a very important implication on the dynamics of the models that we generate. So it would mean that all these nuggets, they express the interactions that compete for the resource. So they compete for the SH2 domain, and therefore they cannot happen at the same time. So now, an example of a dual process that we implement in Kami, a process of instantiation, so the reuse of knowledge in different contexts. And this process is based on backward propagation. So in this figure, I have my action graph from the previous example, and on the top right, I have a definition of a protein graph of two products of a protein graph. It is encoded as a rewriting rule, as an expansive rewriting rule restrictive rewriting rule that clones and removes some elements. So it defines that this definition tells us that GRAB has two protein products, one of which preserves SH2 domain and another one loses it. So it's a splice variant that does not have SH2 domain. Now, having encoded this definition as a rule, we can apply it to the action graph, and we can perform a rewriting, as a result of which I obtain two kinds of products of GRAB, one with SH2 domain, one without SH2 domain at the bottom. And as you may note, I have changed the color of my nodes. And by changing these colors, I wanted to represent the change in the interpretation of the knowledge. Now, our agents of interactions are not these protoforms, these spaces in the sequence of all products of a gene. They represent a concrete protein product, so they represent concrete proteins. And this I represent by changing the color of the node. So now let us have a look at the previous nugget that we have previously added to the system, this interaction that says that AXL binds to GRAB. So I perform a backward propagation, and I perform cloning of our GRAB into two products of GRAB. So one of them now keeps the SH2 domain, and one becomes disconnected, so it does not have SH2 domain. And as a result of this instantiation, now my system knows that the interaction described by the nugget can be realized only for the protein product that has the necessary conditions. So he preserves the resource that is needed for the interaction to happen, while the second protein, the splice variant, loses this interaction. So this interaction cannot be realized in the system where these two products are present. So now I will conclude on this third part of my talk. So we have designed, using our knowledge representation and curation framework, we have designed a pipeline for knowledge curation that allows us to automatically generate the models, signaling models, from knowledge. And we have proposed a decontextualized representation of knowledge that allows us, first of all, to conceptualize the notion of interaction mechanisms, and also allows us to reuse the knowledge in different contexts. So allows us to aggregate knowledge and then reuse it for different concrete signaling models. So we have also implemented this framework as a part of some software. So we created the Python library Kami that provides this pipeline, and we have also designed a web-based environment, so graphical interface for Kami that we call Kami Studio. So now I think it's time for me to draw global conclusions to my talk. So what we have done in this thesis is we have designed a structure called hierarchy of graphs, and we have shown how it can be used to build a representation and curation framework that is particularly suitable for representation of knowledge on complex systems. We have designed mathematical mechanisms that allow us to update knowledge, to perform the audit of these updates, and we have also built the two major use cases of this knowledge representation and curation framework, and one of them operates in the domain of graph databases. It proposes the schema-aware property graph data model, and the second one proposes a framework for biocuration of cellular signaling knowledge that bridges the gap between the knowledge and the dynamical models. And of course, a lot of future work remains to be done. I have put a couple of points in this slide, but I will mention just a couple of them. So first of all, for hierarchies of graphs, we still need to study a lot of classical topics in graph rewriting, how they generalize to hierarchies of graphs. We have also didn't tackle the problem of undo operation in our audit trail. This undo operation is known in this version control, such as Git, as a cherry pick operation. So it would be nice to have a sequence of updates, be able to select any elementary individual update in this sequence and simply try to undo it. This is a very complicated question that is related to the causality of graph rewriting, and it's it's really complicated by the fact of presence of this propagation backward and forward in the hierarchy. And then for schema-aware property graphs, it would be interesting to exploit how we can use richer hierarchies in this context, how we can use, for example, 3-level hierarchies to represent maybe graph views, or we can exploit these richer structures of hierarchies. And finally, Kami, of course, Kami is, there is still a lot of work remains to be done to make a Kami a really mature, powerful biocuration tool. And one of the things that I would like to mention is the integration of Kami with the Kappa platform. So it would make a real powerful rule-based modeling platform. The association with Kami and Kappa would allow us also to perform some kind of, to connect this pipeline into a chain and be able to not only go from knowledge to the models, but also, for example, feed the knowledge from the models back to the Kami. So this would be very interesting to implement it. And I think I will conclude on this note. You can see here some references. Thank you very much for your attention, and please ask me some questions.
Okay, thank you, Eugenia, for showing us different facets of your thesis. So we'll start questions with Glenn Winskell, who was a reviewer of the manuscript.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eugenia, for an impressive piece of work and a very nice talk. It's been a while since I've actually worked on, graph rewriting and biological systems and so on, but one of the first questions I have is just to do with the choice of sesqui pushouts rather than double pushouts and all the rest of it, or in particular why you chose not to use pushouts of partial orders, so pushouts of partial maps between graphs. I think it's because of the no cloning. You wanted cloning, but I think maybe you can just confirm that.
Yes, exactly. So for us, the operation of cloning is a very important operation. As you have seen it, we really use it extensively to perform the data schema coevolution. In our biocuration framework, we use it for this to provide this powerful feature of reuse, of instantiation of knowledge. And therefore, for us, it's really indispensable to have the operation of cloning, and it's not given by a double pushout or a single pushout rewriting approach. So it's really important for us to have this operation.
I see. I mean, to my knowledge, it seems to be fairly recent, this idea of sesqui pushouts. Is that right? I mean, is it just a few years old, or does it go back in a long time? I know it's related to other things, but
yeah, I think it's 2004, or if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, 2004. Okay, okay, as early as that. Okay.
I don't remember exactly, but that's what I remember.
Okay. Just a little, this is maybe crazy, it's a slightly odd question, but with the final pullback complements, they're a bit reminiscent of factorization system, that you talk about maps going one way and you kind of, you find some way of factorizing them in a different way. Do you know if there's a factorization system here?
We didn't look in detail into this question, but I would say that yes, we could have formulated it all in this way. But I cannot give you a very grounded answer on that. I should think about this.
But I'm not sure if there's a factorization system.
We should look into this.
Yeah, you have to characterize the kinds of factorizations you get associated with these fullback complements and final ones in particular. There are junctions all over the place here. As soon as you kind of move from one typing graph to another typing graph, you've got associated, when you've got things of those typings, you've got functors then going between, in both directions actually, which are adjoints, going from one side, going from things of one type to things of another type. How much are you using that?
Well, actually, we don't use it, like we don't go so abstractly. We are really pragmatic people, and for us, we use category theory on demand, We have like all this, even this framework was born somehow, it was motivated always by the application, and mostly actually by the application to Kami, to this biocuration of cellular signaling knowledge. And of course, it provides us this beautiful system of change of base functor in our slice categories, but we have never actually formulated it in an abstract way, and because it's all very pragmatically grounded. And of course, it would be interesting to study it all in the language, more abstract language, and to see how it plays, what beautiful kind of mechanism play there.
Yeah, it wasn't so much to kind of go abstract for the sake of going abstract, though I tend to do that myself a bit. But it was more to because it might link up with some tools. In particular, abstract interpretation is concerned with understanding degraded versions of things. And so these are junctions that you'll have not just on single graphs, but of course, but also these hierarchies. I mean, they might give you ways of abstracting away and understanding degraded versions of things before you understand the full thing. So that was partly where I was thinking of. So connections with abstract interpretation, I guess, is what I was fishing for. Do you use abstract interpretation much here? You talked about static analysis, but
yes, no, actually, we didn't discover this direction. And in general, of course, hierarchies provide a very beautiful generalization of things. So the fact that we have not only two typed objects, but entire hierarchies would allow us to build some very interesting and find some interesting phenomena in this applied to abstract interpretation. But really, I am not a specialist of that, and we have not really investigated in that direction with RAS. And so far, we have always been focused on this knowledge representation thing. And
it seems like a very rich framework that you have. I mean, with these hierarchies of graphs. I mean, I'm not so familiar with the area. So is this a new idea? I mean, I of course, people have been working with limited versions of this, where they're just thinking about typings and, as you say, change of base and things like that. But is this new to your? Does it originate with you?
So
this idea?
To my knowledge, yes, because I have seen a lot of work on the typed graphs, so they exist in the graph transformation community, but maybe also Barbara can help us, she knows much better than us. But from all the literature that I have studied, that I have seen, I have never seen the generalization to entire hierarchies of objects. It would be always chains or maybe pairs of objects, and this concept of typed graph is, of course, very widely used. And also, of course, I have even seen the idea similar to our backward-forward propagation in terms of the typed graphs, but mostly based also not on Sesky push-out, but on double push-out approaches or single push-out approaches. But actually, the power of Sesky push-out approach, this cloning, allows us to build interesting things that are become more interesting than double push-out, the typed graphs in the settings of double push-out rewriting approach, because this concept refinement is something practically very, very useful and actually very powerful for data modeling. And therefore, this the fact that we first use push-out rewriting approach for this, and second that we generalize it then to entire hierarchies, makes it novel, at least to my knowledge of the things. I may be wrong.
Yeah, no, it's a very rich framework that you've got here. And as you say, tying things to practice means it's potentially very important. But I'm no expert in this area, but I can imagine that. Just seeing what else I was thinking about. Oh yes, I think I admitted in my report in your chapter, I think it's chapter 3, where you're talking about schema. Is that? That's another issue where I wasn't quite sure about the state of the art. Is that a new idea? This idea of using representing schema by homomorphisms?
No, this is not a new idea. First of all, there are two very widely used models like data models for graph databases. First one is RDF. So it's a slightly different data model that actually, it has some difference in internal representation of our data. And there, the schemas for RDFs it's a very developed topic. It's a very standardized thing. There are a lot of tools for schema data coevolution, while for property graphs is a relatively new model, and for the property graphs, this not yet exists. And also, even for the RDF, so for schemas, of course, it's not a new idea to use the homomorphisms, but to exploit these homomorphisms and use these propagation techniques to perform the coevolution, I think this is novel even for RDFs, if we take this data model.
Okay, good. Yes, I think it could have quite an influence on the area then, by the sound of it. Years ago, I was involved with kappa rewriting and stuff like that. That's not been you talk about the automation of that when you go from the biocuration to automation of generating kappa rules and things like that. How far has that gone?
So now we are able to take the knowledge that we have. So as I explained before, we can instantiate it. So we actually make it, we can build concrete signaling models that are still represented as hierarchies, graph hierarchies, our internal graph hierarchies. And then we developed a procedure that searches, that traverses these graphs in our hierarchies and generates kappa scripts. So we can generate kappa scripts that can be simulated with CASIM4, like the last version of the simulator. So we actually succeeded to completely generate these kappa scripts, except for a couple of points. So we are able to generate the rules, we are able to generate the agents, we are able to generate the initial conditions even, for example, how many proteins bound to this protein already present in the system, but we still don't know how to generate observables. So there is also, because in kappa, to make a kappa script working, really, when you click the button and it simulates, you need to provide these observables. And now Kami kind of generate pre-kappa, where there is everything, and you just need to fix the observables.
I see. And I guess another thing that you might try the kind of tools of the kind that Jérôme Ferré build. I suppose you could try and incorporate those. Is there any? Have you made moves in that direction at all?
So actually, we didn't do any moves in that direction, but we envisaged to do that, or I was supposed to actually do that. We were supposed to have internship together with Jérôme and to make some static analysis of knowledge, because Kami is a really perfect place to perform static analysis. And everything, the representation of Kami is this, everything can be brought to some graph traversal algorithms, and everything is very, very well suited for really putting static analysis inside of the Kami as a level of, because also the static analysis is a very important thing for knowledge curation. For example, you have your knowledge, you have your corpus, but you want to perform some analysis and say, oh, I have some gaps in the knowledge, and maybe I should fill up these gaps. And all this detection of these gaps between knowledge, or some kind of influences between different pieces of knowledge, which interaction that I explained enables or prevents some other interaction. This is very natural place to go. But unfortunately, due to the time constraints and kind of circumstances, we didn't go there. Yes. But it's a good question, because that was our plan and we were supposed to do it, and it's going to be done soon, I hope.
I guess I got to ask you now, what will you do? What do you want to do? Given the time and freedom to do it, what's the burning aim that you have that's left over from this thesis?
You mean in the for the
In the
thesis for
future.
coming in the thesis? Yes. So now what we want to do, we are actually working. So we developed this audit trail, and it works in the generic. So we implemented it. But we have not built a very good use case for this audit trail in the context of biology, because actually that's why we develop it. Because when we have, imagine we have a large knowledge corpus that is created by multiple curators, we want to have this Git, we want to have this version control for multiple curators, adding little pieces, changing, and we want really to build this powerful, nice use case that would illustrate how indispensable to have a version control for knowledge, and how it can be really powerful, also very efficient, very well built for knowledge, which represented with graphs. So this beauty of using graphs also allows us not only to work on the differences between text files, but actually on some semantically meaningful differences like these ASCII push-out rewriting rules or rule hierarchy. So I would say that this would be the first future direction to build this, because we already see this use case. We just need to build it and actually advocate it, elaborate it, the use case of audit trail.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can continue with questions by Barbara.
Okay, so first, thanks a lot for the very nice talk. So there were some remarks which were maybe a bit directed to me, so maybe I'll answer them first. So the SESQ push-out paper was from 2006. I had to look it up myself. I didn't know it. But let me just share an anecdote. So when we did this, actually, it was not our intention at all to do any cloning. We just wanted to replicate a single push-out approach, so especially deletion of edges in unknown context with total morphisms, because this is nicer instead of partial morphisms. And then the cloning was just a side effect that we said, oh, look, now it clones. But apparently this was quite successful. I was very surprised myself by how many people picked that up in the end. Okay, and then there are typing hierarchies. I mean, people did study hierarchies of graphs, of course, but I'm not aware of rewriting in where you really have a hierarchy of typed graphs and rewrite the whole hierarchy. I'm not aware of anything that goes in this direction. Okay, now I'll come to my questions. The first one is actually even a bit technical, and because when I read your thesis, I was actually quite confused about this forward and backward propagation. And I think you already partially answered this in your talk, so some of the confusion that I had has already lifted, but still a bit of confusion remains. So I wanted to ask you, there's something that is called a forward factorization, or I think there's also backward factorization, but now I'm looking at the definition of the forward factorization. And so it's basically, the idea is that you have an expansive rule and you have the left-hand side is typed over a type graph. And now you want to see how to modify the type graph. And for this, there is this concept of forward factorization. And it's called its forward factorization, which suggests that it's unique, but I think it's not unique, right?
Yes, it's not unique. So the forward factorization is for us the way to control this forward propagation. As I have here, I kind of said we have three scenarios. We can have canonical, or we can have no propagation, or combined. And actually, this is the mechanism through which I control which scenario do I realize. So I have a choice of these factorizations, and factorization simply just specifies, I kind of split the application of this expansive rewrite into two steps. And this is a factorization, and just these two steps allow me to control how do I propagate to the typing graph. And so it's, of course, it's not unique, but it is our mathematical tool to specify which scenario do I want to realize in the given context.
Okay, yes. So you can choose this forward factorization. I think there are lots of choices. I mean, I think you showed some of them already in your talk, but when I read the thesis, that confused me a bit. And then you can choose whether you want the strict rewrite or the canonical rewrite, right? So there's a lot of parameters that you can choose. So who chooses this? I mean, how do you want to do this in practice? I mean, who makes the choice here?
Yes, yes. So in practice, we have implemented it in our library, and we have provided some interface to choose this factorization. But actually, we don't give a user this choice of creating graph objects, creating homomorphisms, because it's actually very tedious to, for example, this forward factorization, it would be very tedious to ask user every time to specify it. We have some tools that allow us to do it. They actually allow us to implement not full power of the factorization, but most of the cases, so like the family of these factorizations, that is actually reasonable, we can say, no? And this is, we call controlled propagation. So in the thesis, there is this mini section where I actually elaborate a bit on that. So we use some kind of relations between if in the case of forward propagation, between the right-hand side of the rule and the graph, and the typed in graph, that allows us to, in a very kind of small, compact, and intuitive way, to define how to type new things by already existing things. And in the case of backward, it's the same applies to cloning. Which instances do I retype? And so we designed some nice interface that does not implement a full power, but implements, let's say, all the reasonable ones. And then, of course, you can provide also, if you really want to have some very specific case, you can encode the graphs and homomorphisms.
Okay, so you get some kind of suggestions like, look, I mean, either you add this or this is something that is already there, so you should type it over the existing thing, something like this?
Yeah, something like this, not actually now like this, because it's all programmatic interface. So let's say there is no interaction between the machine, but I provide some tutorials, some nice workflows that can be adapted, some good practices how to do it. And it's actually very simple. You just select from existing types if you want to use. And if you don't want to, then you don't. So we also follow kind of rule-based modeling. Do not care, do not write. So if user does not specify anything, everything is canonical. Everything is conservative and canonical. But if user wants to intrude in this system, then user can specify, I will use this type, or I will clone this instance if I know.
Okay, good, thank you. I mean, there's one more question about this, and from the forward propagation. The forward propagation, you want to replace L by L plus, or extend by L plus rather. But now in the strict rewrite, actually you rewrite with something else. So you don't actually do what the user initially had in mind, right? So then you add this L prime.
So this is example of this. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to ask, how can we understand this? I mean, is there some explanation that explains this?
Yes. So at the end, I actually replace my pattern with L+. So everything happens as I want, but I just perform it in two-step way. So I don't immediately replace the pattern with L+, but what I do is I split this entire rewriting into two phases, which one phase would be, again, I will not say phases, not to confuse with this restrictive and expansive, let's say steps. So I have two-step procedure, and having this two-step procedure allows me to specify, so there is some portion of changes that are specified by the rule that are actually can be performed in a strict case. So where I can say, these new elements are actually typed by existing objects, so I don't need to update existing objects, and only then I postpone all the rewrites or the transformations that actually induce the change of the typing object. I postpone them to the second step, and this allows me to control this again, to control.
Okay. So there would be another step where you add what still has to be added and see how to retype this. Okay, thank you. Then let me see. Okay, maybe I should ask about delta compression. So as I understand, this delta compression is just there to store the difference between the graphs. You cannot reconstruct the whole sequence, right? I mean, if you have an update sequence, there's also other information like matches or something like this. You cannot restore this, but just roll back to what you had before, and then you have to do things again.
Exactly, yes. So in our implementation, for example, again, because it really gives a good example of intuitively how these things work, we store the entire history of updates. And if you, for example, I don't know if you have seen how in GitHub or in Git, how this sequence of commits and different branches, how they look. So we really store this information. And for every commit, so every change to the hierarchy, we have a rule hierarchy, some matches, and also, of course, we can restore, switch to other versions by going all the way back where the versions branched, then going all the way to another version. But this is very long and computationally a bit, it takes resources. So what we have, we store these sequences, and they are used when we actually need to undo things or when we need to do some very advanced operations. It is used at some point. But for the switching between versions, to make it efficient and fast, we have like the heads, so the ends of each version, and we can immediately switch to them. So we can switch between them without going back and forth in this branched history of updates. It's really kind of a shortcut way to do so we use a bit more memory by storing delta, but we save a lot of time on using it.
Okay, thank you. A bit connected to this is a remark you made towards the end of your talk, where you said you would like to implement undo operations. So pointing at a specific update and say, I only want to undo this. Could you say a bit more about this? I mean, assuming you have to implement this somehow, how would you address this?
Yes. So it's a very interesting and complicated problem, this undo. Of course, it's not always possible to undo the changes. So I can select some update and I say I undo it. But of course, there are a lot of the updates that happen after this update relies on this update happening. So for example, when we use the nodes created at that step, or we clone them or use them, of course, so we need to study. So what I would like to have is some kind of a system that you can select the update, and the system analyzes which parts of this update can be undone without breaking the entire sequence in front, and maybe undoing them actually, and which updates cannot be undone without disabling the updates that happen after. So it's actually not a very simple problem, and also that's why we left it to the last point. It's a very advanced operation. It provides a lot of unanswered questions,
Yes, you said something about causality. I think that goes in the right direction. I mean, it looks to me like you need a partial order representation of your updates. I mean, not sure whether you're familiar with unfoldings. So, I mean, you could also represent your updates by an unfolding, and then you see what is dependent on what. I think this would greatly help to solve this.
Yes, absolutely. I didn't look into it, but absolutely we had this in mind to investigate this approach, and that's also would bring our hierarchies in the direction of causality, which would be also very interesting, because maybe we would discover and generalize some things that are known about the causality of graph transformations in general to the hierarchies of things. Because also, for example, for us, imagine even if we do this unfolding, but we work on the single object, but now imagine that we have a hierarchy of objects, and then some transformation induces backwards or forward propagation that actually enables some other things. So it makes the dimensionality of the problem a bit more, it explodes a little bit more, but that's why it's actually maybe a PhD in itself. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question. Some of the things you're doing remind me a bit of bidirectional model transformation. Not sure if you're familiar with that. I mean, usually there you have only two levels in your hierarchy, the model and the view. And then there are two problems. Either you update the model, then you have to update the view. And if you update the view, then you maybe want to propagate this back to the model. Do you look into this? I think there's, for instance, the theory of lenses by Benjamin Pierce. Okay, if you haven't seen this, it's probably a bit hard to compare, but
yeah, but I mean, from what you say, absolutely, it seems very, very relevant and can be imported some ideas from.
Yes, I think there are probably a few cases where you have to make this repair when you change one level, that you have to do something to the other level to repair things. Okay, so I have one question that is a bit theoretical. I mean, your principle, you can do all this on the level of adhesive categories, and then you can do rewriting on more complex objects. Did you think about whether you could make a category where the entire hierarchy is an object, and then you have morphisms that are, of course, more complex, and you switch to this more complex category but reuse results from rewriting for adhesive categories.
Yes, of course, we have thought about this, and we have also thought that it would be a very interesting generalization of everything, and of also hierarchies. We could build hierarchies of hierarchies. Haven't seen hierarchies as objects. We could build hierarchies of hierarchies and rewrite hierarchies of hierarchies of hierarchies. And well, this is for sure a feasible way to proceed, but we haven't looked into this because it's kind of goes beyond our main interest, and it's just maybe interesting. We would say that it's some kind of interesting mind exercise, but so far we didn't have nice utility of doing so, of really formulating everything level up of the abstraction. But of course, I think it would be interesting to see how whether some interesting things emerge from that.
Okay, thank you. Now I have a last question about your application in biology. I have to admit I do not know that much about biology, but it sounds very exciting. Now that you have this CAMI tool, so the question is, I think you already know quite a lot about biology, so you know how to model, but my question is, did you also show it to biologists, and did they try to model something in there, and what features would be missing? Now, I assume you really want to use this as the tool in biology to do biocuration. Is it a first step? Are you already almost there, or what is missing to use it in a bigger context?
Thank you. Yes, indeed, we actually developed this tool in a collaboration with biologists. So, for example, even previously we were working with Sebastian, who has a background in structural biology, so he would always input the requirements, so we really would implement a lot of things, having consulted the biologists and what they would like to do. And of course, this tool, I would say that it's first and a half step, in the sense that the tool is already usable and it can be, and now we are working on so we have some collaborations that are working on building models. Also, it kind of allows to use a new modeling paradigm of these models of nothing, where you don't really have some preconceived idea of what do you model, you just input a lot of knowledge, and then you see what emerges from this. So, for example, now Sebastian was building a system of inputting, just curating a lot of literature, taking a lot of knowledge from different databases and from the literature, and just inputting all the interactions related to some SH2 domains, some domains that actually well encoded in our system, and seeing which kind of macroscopic things emerge. So then building a model that actually doesn't represent anything preconceived, just all the knowledge that you could find in this particular direction, and then trying to study causality of events, finding some new pathways, because biologists are very interested in finding these pathways, like you had some event of interest and what have led to this event of interest. And so, yes, indeed, we really collaborate closely to biologists, but our tool is still ongoing, because for example, this static analysis that Glenn was mentioning would be indispensable for building nice, reasonable modeling or curation environment, because when you have this big, as soon as your corpus becomes large, you really have no idea how to analyze it statically, in the sense that you don't know what's missing, what you should look into. So it would be nice to develop a lot of tools that would suggest to biologists some kind of, here there is a conflict in the knowledge, here there is a gap, here there is, look into this, it looks weird, because maybe we could encode some hypothesis or some kind of ground rules that detect some possible conflicts.
Okay, thanks. That's it from my side.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps I will continue with questions, because I was with you and I have a few questions. I like to see your work as providing a theoretical framework to design a versioning system for models, biomodels. And indeed, this is really missing, and that this has been recognized since years, like SBML models, System Biology Markup Language. Models in model repositories like biomodels are just a flat list of models, and with no facility to make any updates and propagate the changes and so on. So I have a few questions on this perspective. First, I've not seen the computational complexity of the operations you use, like for forward propagation or backward propagation. Can you tell us about the computational complexity?
Yes, of course. So here, this computational complexity is some function, I'll tell you, that depends actually on a number of instances of things. So, for example, when we perform backward propagation, we operate on the types of things, of nodes and edges, and these changes, they are propagated to all the instances in the graphs that are typed by the target of rewriting. So here, our complexity is also a function of number of instances. So, for example, if I have 100 instances of a circle that I clone and I need to retype each of them. Of course, this is one of the variables. And then, of course, all the operations are polynomial in number of nodes and edges. So they are, because they're just proportional to the classical transformation operations that we do. Because what we actually do is removal of the node with all the incident edges as a side effect. And this has a complexity polynomial in the number of edges, because imagine that this node connected with an edge to every single node. So this is all the complexity of operation we perform, clone, remove, add, multiplied by the number of instances that we have.
Yeah, it's certainly a polynomial. I expect perhaps quadratic complexity.
Yeah, like any classical operation, quadratic, for example, quadratic in the number of nodes. Because the number of edges is worst case quadratic in the number of nodes, so I guess quadratic in the number of nodes, or linear, but in the number of nodes and edges.
Okay. Okay, and then this framework for versioning also could support more ambitious operations involving search. So perhaps you remember I sent you papers we have done on subgraph epimorphism. So that was designed in order to detect model reduction relationships between models. And so we were looking for the existence of surjective subgraph isomorphisms between two models as an indication of a possible model reduction, because such subgraph isomorphisms and surjective ones indicate that you go from one model graph to another one by merging species or reactions, or deleting species or reaction that you neglect. So it's a kind of model reduction. And so have you thought about using your framework for search problem of this kind? Also, like detecting existence of homomorphisms between the graph of some kind?
Yes, so far we actually, for us, it's not, we never go into the direction of combinatorics, and so for us, we always use existing tools, like state-of-the-art tools for searching. For example, in our framework, we very often perform the operation of search of, for us, it's always subgraph isomorphism, so we match a pattern inside of the graph. This we do very often, but it's not our domain of the research. We use the existing tools that, for example, provided by this Neo4j database or by the libraries that we use. So it's not actually our direction of the research. And of course, I think integrating some cool new tools for different search problems would make the framework very powerful. But this is kind of out of the scope of the spirit in which we work. For us, we are more using all the algorithms as an interface. And when people develop good algorithms, we use them.
Yes, okay. But I was not asking the question so much about the algorithm, but more on the operations that you are allowed to at least define in your framework. So, for instance, that would be very interesting for a biologist, for a modeler, is to be able, given two models on which you already know some mappings between the models, they speak about the same process, but they have different levels of detail. So in one model, you detail some part of the network, in another model, you detail another part of the network, kappa models. And then it would be very nice to get the combined model, which combines the different details of both models automatically. This could be used immediately in biomodels. We do have models like that, which are more detailed on different parts. And so it's not easy to define even theoretically whether you have a uniqueness of this kind of least upper bound of the models or deepest lower bound in the other direction. It was not the case for subgraph epimorphism setting. Does it make sense to you in your setting to have this kind of operations? And do you get uniqueness in the categorical setting for combining models, or do you need more information?
Yeah, I think it would be interesting for Kami, for also maybe combining for us. I think it would be very interesting to combine some approach of this kind for nuggets, because we have our protein interactions can be represented on different abstraction levels. They can be either very phenomenological, active protein A, activate protein B, or they can be very mechanistic, like phosphorylated in this residue protein A phosphorylate. So I think that your approach could be well integrated into the framework for adding, for merging different abstraction levels of these different nuggets. And I think it's actually a good direction to look into. And also these graph epimorphisms, they could be integrated in our hierarchies, because actually even the partial maps can be represented as spans, where there is an object that represents the common part. And so you can actually integrate it into hierarchies. You can create some kind of relations between nuggets that explain this relation between entities of higher or lower abstraction level. So yeah, I think actually it would be a very good direction to look into, especially for nuggets, because it's a very big problem now that we cannot, our knowledge is not on some unique level of abstraction, of even mechanistic knowledge. We still have this different family of possible representations of interaction, as I told you, more phenomenological or more mechanistic detailed. And I think this subgraph epimorphism can be used to add them together, to kind of combine them and maybe merge them for generating better models. I hope.
Okay, and a little question I am curious about. I heard Walter Fontana speaking at Collège de France on knowledge representation for biomodels. And I'm just wondering whether you have interacted a lot with him or a bit with him.
Yes, we are part of the same team, kind of, in the spirit. I mean, Ras is one of the people who worked on Kappa extensively, and we interact with Walter. We also interact, for example, one of his PhD students was building model in Kappa that should be a very, very good use case for our Kami, and we collaborate, and in future I think there would be some nice use case collaborations of our system, but on the maybe together with Walter and his students.
Okay, thank you. So now I move to the chairman position and I ask Pierre-Antoine Champin to ask a question, if any.
Yes, thank you very much. Great talk. Very interesting work. Maybe a few remarks about the questions that have been asked previously. You mentioned RDF as you know, I'm more familiar with this with RDF than with property graphs, and so it's fair to say that the kind of work that you presented is also relatively new, even in the RDF world, which has been much concerned with describing ontologies more than schemas per se. That is, shape languages, as we call them in RDF, are relatively recent as well. That being said, I was a bit surprised not to see any reference to John Sowa's conceptual graphs in your thesis, which are very seminal work on graph-based representations, and I haven't read Sowa's work in a long time, but my intuition is that Sowa's notion of projection of graphs is really close to the homomorphism that you're using. Now, so I'll get away with the nasty question first. You present this work as a knowledge representation framework, and I definitely see a lot of values in that field. Yet, it seems to me to be mostly focused on syntax. I don't think that you or maybe I missed something, but you don't define any semantics for this framework. Am I wrong?
Little bit. So
Okay.
I will elaborate on that. So of course, in the case of application to databases, it's true that it actually defines that we define the shape of our data, we enforce the shape. But for example, our Kami provides a very good example of how we can specify not only syntaxes, but we can also encode some semantics in graph hierarchies and relations between graphs. So for example, if I now change to the slide back to the biocuration part, sorry, let me do like this. So in the first, when I was presenting Kami, what I mentioned is that, sorry, I jumped too much. Okay. Sorry, my computer is very slow. So yes, so when I was mentioning the representation of Kami, I said that the protein interactions are encoded with these little graphs that are all typed by the action graph. And so this homomorphism of nuggets to the action graph does not only specify the syntaxes, so what things that I have said, but it also encodes the semantics of which things are the same, which things are not the same, which entities and actions are identified as the same. I have also used in the hierarchy, so you see this is the shape of hierarchy about which I was not talking in a lot of details, but in this hierarchy, we encode a lot of semantics. So for example, we have some graphs that are called semantic nuggets, semantic action graphs, that describe some kind of, I don't know, ontologies, or they describe some semantic entities that exist in the signaling systems and how they are, and we attach these semantics to the graphs. So we really use this homomorphism in this diagram. Actually, my green arrow is not a homomorphism, but it's a relation between graphs, but I encode it as a homomorphism also. So we can attach semantics to our nuggets, and this semantic part is actually something that I kept behind the scenes in this talk, because we have semantics of protein interactions, we have templates, which templates is actually rather syntaxes because it describes the shape, but we can assign these semantics, and it's just the way the semantics is very domain specific. So there is no semantical, there is no specific tools to assign semantics, but we can encode some semantic things in the hierarchy itself. I don't know, I hope I explained it just a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. That clarifies things. I was not arguing that semantics could not be encoded in this formalism. I'm convinced that it can. I was just pointing out that, and you just said that it's domain specific. So let's say it's a foundation for knowledge representation, maybe more than the framework, and I'm guessing some guidelines or good practices or patterns for how to correctly and efficiently encode my domain-specific semantics in such a formalism would be a nice perspective to help people appropriate and do useful things in other domains with this framework. Regarding that, I'm not quite comfortable with it. Well, I really like this idea of having a hierarchy of graphs, but this notion of type instance distinction is a bit not quite aligned with my own mental model of that. I think if you go back to slide 33, I think I noticed that you propose 3 levels. That's it. No, yeah, that's the one. So P is L is the type of P, and P is the type of so maybe the next one where you so L is the type of P and P is the type of S prime, right?
Yes. So yeah, actually here we don't. It's better not to call it typing because maybe it's a bit a problem in my. I didn't illustrate it well because what is illustrated on the top is a rewriting rule. So it's just our rewriting rule that says post and comment map to the message. So I and this is how I specify the cloning operation. So I say that from the message I obtain 2 nodes. And in this case, I would rather, probably it's me who made it's a little bit confusing because it would be nice to separate this rule in some kind of separate box to see that it's not something that operates, it's not the first citizen of the hierarchy, it's only the graph S that is the first citizen of the hierarchy. The thing on top is just the way I encode the transformation. I could have also encoded it with some programmatic interface saying, clone me a message, clone me the node message.
Okay, so you wouldn't keep the 3 levels in your hierarchy. That's is that what you're saying? Because
Yeah, so
it would work, right?
Yes, it would work. It would work definitely. But in this case, in this example, I use a 2-level hierarchy, and I just show one.
Okay.
I just show one of the graphs. My hierarchy is, for example, sorry, I'm a bit slow because I have multiple screens sharing, broadcasting, and it's all complicated. So my hierarchy is rather is 2 graphs, data and schema. And homomorphism is just encoded. I encode it with colors. And in the examples after that, I simply operate of one of the graphs. So it just maybe I failed a little bit to illustrate it intuitively.
No, it's interesting because it stresses my point that this homomorphism relationship could be used to capture different things, like the classical class instance relationship as we have in ontologies, as well as in that case it's in your rule the homomorphism is more like a class subclass relationship, so it's slightly different, and it could be misleading or confusing, mixing different semantics or meta semantics in the various relationship of your hierarchy. But if I understand correctly, so you are promoting, so to speak, a schema instance or class instance in the ontological sense, distinction between the levels of your hierarchy.
Exactly,
right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
At least in this example, I can use it in different ways, but in this example, we really just say we have data instance, which has multiple instances of the entities and relationships that are defined by the schema. So it's really instance and relations.
Okay. Now, also, when you present the first figures that you presented very abstractly with a lattice of graphs, gave me some ideas, and I'm not sure how much you have explored or considered this kind of scenario, but you mostly insist on having different levels of abstractions. Okay, so like instance schema, meta schema, somehow. But could this be used as well to represent maybe different points of view or different aspects of the same knowledge base? Would that be appropriate as well?
Yes, I think indeed it would be a very interesting use case. I will come back to the image you referred to. My computer is very slow, so I'm doing it. Oh, sorry. Okay. So if I come back to this example, I can see this diamond, and if I study, for example, the left part of this diamond, this mini diamond, so it consists of 4 squares, no? And this left square, I could think of 2 graphs on the side, on the left and in the center, as being 2 viewpoints that are kind of grounded in the same syntaxes, so they are expressed in the same abstract terms, but they are uncomparable abstraction levels, so they may be we cannot put a relation between them, but they can as well represent these 2 different viewpoints, alternative viewpoints of the thing, first the same instance, and second that is grounded in the same meta model, grounded in the same syntaxes, if you wish. I hope it answers your question. That it is indeed an interesting way to look at the things.
Yes, I think that would be a really useful application of that framework. Also, you mentioned data schema coevolution, which is a topic dear to my heart. and which I think has been not studied enough, at least in the domain that I know better. That's the RDF and semantic web community. But and so you're focusing more on the property graph model, where your nodes and edges are associated with dictionaries with let's say atomic attributes. And I was wondering if the evolution of your schema, I feel that sometimes you start by modeling some attributes of entities as part of the dictionary, and then later on you might feel the need to reify them by representing some of those attributes by relations in the graphs. And do your operations allow for, capture this kind of change as well?
No, so the operations we cannot express as a part of our rewriting framework. We cannot express this operation of transition from an attribute to the graph element, but what we can do, we cannot encode it with some rules, but what we can do, we can design some higher level interface, and which we actually do. For example, we can match some patterns in our graphs, and according to, even here in the example that I have shown you, I have decided whether instances of the message are post or comment by examining the attributes. So I could have, but I would say that this is the separate level of logic that is built on the top of the rewriting. So I use rewriting to implement what I want, but it's not inherently naturally expressed by our rewriting semantics. So I can first create a query that analyzes the attributes, and then I can create a rule that creates a new node that has the properties something, and that removes the previous attribute. And by this, let's say I encode moving the property into a node. So it's a second level. It's not really expressed by this rewriting. It's a second level of logic. It's with different semantics, but it's indeed can be done easily. And in our examples of this prototype system, we actually examine attributes. We generate the rules according to the attributes, properties. I always call them attributes because we call them attributes, but I mean properties.
And those rules will be captured as well in your audit trail.
Yes, so they will be captured as audit trail, not the reasoning behind them, because the reasoning behind them, how did I decide that I add this new node? But the operation that is expressed with our semantics, of course, will be captured in the audit trail.
Okay, nice. Now, I have just a crazy idea coming up right now, but as you know, there's a lot of discussion currently between the RDF and property graph communities and some efforts trying to find a common model or something that would ease the transition between the two models. So could this notion of transformation and homomorphism be used, do you think, to provide some transition from a property graph model to an RDF model, or backward?
Indeed, it's a very interesting question, and I think because RDF encodes, so RDF does not allow, for other members of jury also, the RDF does not allow to equip our nodes and edges with some internal structure of properties. It just represents every property as a separate node. Yes, exactly. Everything in the node is an edge. So it would be like Bob as a node has name and the node Bob, something like this. So, and I think that this operation of transition between RDF and maybe, let's say, packing of RDF into property graphs would be something, as you mentioned, that brings the level of attributes or flips, folds the nodes and produces folds the graph elements into the properties. So this actually is again outside of our framework, but I think this would be very interesting to be able to express the rules where we have some kind of values of attributes or keys of attributes or properties as variables. So for example, what we could say, we could match a pattern that says, if I have a node person who has an edge that says has name Bob, then I want to create a rule that merges these two nodes, but then I say name X So the value of the thing would be x, and then I put x in the property of the node. I don't know if I explained it well, but the idea is that it would be interesting to, then if we are able to have these variable properties, we could actually write a rewriting rule that collapses RDFs into property graphs and assigns the new properties as necessary, as specified by the rule. So indeed, it's a very cool direction to look into.
Yeah. Yeah,
thank you.
That would be nice. Thank you. And maybe a last question. So, regarding the shapes that you specify in the higher level graphs in your hierarchy, is it possible to define some? For example, some constraints like cardinality constraints on how many nodes of type person can be linked to type message, or I was thinking of that, and maybe also some structural constraints on the relationships. For example, if I had a relations from one type of node to the same type of node, so in your schema it's represented by just a loop, a small loop. But what about a relationship like parent, where a person is a parent of another person, but obviously I don't want loops in the instance graph, for example. Can you express this kind of constraint?
So this is also a good question, and I have actually put this answer to this question in our future work. So to answer that, we didn't implement it, but it would be great, and it would be a natural place to be able, in our hierarchies, our typing graphs, if our typing graphs can specify not only which types of nodes and edges are allowed and their properties, but can also constrain the typed graphs. Like, for example, say if we could encode some calculus saying, yes, at least or maximum 2 edges are allowed from this node or from this type of node. So person can have only 2 edges as parent, I don't know, and things like that. And also with the loops, I guess it would be the same kind of calculus. With the same calculus we could have expressed it, but this is absolutely outside of our framework at the moment, because also it would be easy to implement it and to make it our graphs respect these constraints, but what would be hard is to incorporate these constraints into the rewriting framework. So then if these constraints are actually integrated in the hierarchy and not some higher level logic on the top of our graphs, then we don't know how to actually perform skip-shot rewriting, how to perform operations of these push-outs, pullbacks. How do we do that? So I mean, this needs to be investigated. So it's not a very obvious question if we want to make it really integrated in the framework. We could easily build higher level logic that does it. It's not a problem, but integrating consistently into rewriting, that's, I don't know how easily it can be done.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps now we can finish with comments by the thesis advisor, Russ Armour.
Okay, thank you, Francois. So I just want to say a few things that relate to other questions that have been posed. So the work on Cami was originally developed on a DARPA project with Walter Fontana. The first prototype and even the earlier stages of what Eugenius presents today were done in close collaboration with Walter. Concerning something that I think Glyn and Barbara mentioned, and Eugenia herself. So Walter's student, Hector, who has recently defended his PhD, he developed in his work a very large kappa model, so directly in kappa. This was done before Cami existed, okay? It's a very large model. There's a couple of thousand rules in it, and it's difficult to read. It's very difficult to change anything. What I have been doing in the last few weeks, and this is the beginning of a longer-term project, is to reinvestigate how this model was created. It's well annotated. There are references to papers, and there are textual summaries of what the rules means and so on. So there's some archaeology to do, but he has made the task reasonable. But this would actually give rise to a very nice use case of the audit trail work. So this is what Eugenia was saying. because often these kappa rules, they're not coming from one paper. There are multiple papers that have had to be combined in the brain of the student, but this could be reified into a series of transformations that would be seen and made visible in the audit trail. So it makes a lot clearer the provenance of the model. So if I'm allowed to ask a question, I think I am.
No.
As I've just started doing this, and in reading some of these papers, I'm finding that there's not only mechanistic information of the kind that we put in CAMI and which is in the kappa rules there. There's also quite a lot of more phenomenological information. This signal activates this gene or stuff like that. And it would be very useful if that could be represented in CAMI and then somehow maybe to try to use the kappa to verify these things as assertions. Does that make any sense? Because you said something at the very end of your talk about wanting to use kappa to come back to CAMI. Is this an example of that?
Yes, it's exactly the example. So what would be interesting to do is if we have some either phenomenological knowledge or maybe some hypothesis. So one of the interactions is actually not that we know, but we hypothesize. We could be able to go simulate it, verify it, and then feed it back to CAMI as a already new piece of knowledge. And this knowledge may be, for example, on the already either more phenomenological level, if I can say more phenomenological, or either phenomenological level or a mechanistic level. So for example, also what I think I see clearly only the one direction first. So for example, if we have mechanistic knowledge, we can assert the phenomenological knowledge. So for example, we can say if protein B phosphorylated in this residue phosphorylates protein C, then what we can do, we can simulate and see if protein C is activated or protein B is activated by this. So we can get a knowledge of phenomenological nature that says protein A activates protein B. So actually this effect of this phosphorylation that it performs has some nice semantic interpretation in our case. So it has its activity, and in this case we may even put some kind of provenance, not provenance, but some annotation. What do we mean by this activity? We mean that activity actually is in binding to another protein. This I can see clearly, but now of course there are no automatized tools. It can be done ad hoc. So we can ad hoc feed the knowledge, ad hoc generate in a systematized way input the knowledge, this is okay, then build a model. But then this formulation of assertions is ad hoc. And of course, it would be nice to provide a system where we separate from a real facts, we separate assertions or hypotheses, and it allows us to move backwards and forwards, certify things and change their status from hypotheses or assertions to maybe even the facts, let's say. What do you think?
Okay. So these assertions would be part of CAMI, it would be something new, it wouldn't be something that you can express with the current meta model and so on, but it could be extended in a way to provide syntax for these things, at least.
Yes, and it could be encoded in the meta model because our meta model allows to do express very phenomenological things like disactivation and stuff. So it could be, but it should be tagged. I think there should be some tagging, because in CAMI also one of the things that we didn't implement well yet is a nice annotation system for the knowledge, because there is a lot of different standards and we still didn't converge on which system of annotation to adopt to our knowledge. So when this good annotation system emerges for us, that we make some decision, we can make some tagging of provenance of knowledge, and maybe our assertions are actually they are represented as nuggets, so internally to CAMI representation, but they have different status. They have different status of being epistemological status, of being assertions and not facts, or not like something I need to check.
Okay, I understand the idea. Yeah, okay. But there could also be further, as I was saying, gene expression is something that was just a design choice that was already sufficiently complicated to deal with the interactions. In that case, I guess the meta model could be extended to express such things. But then I understand, the distinction mechanistic phenomenological, it's not so clear cut. They could all be syntactically the same kind of entity, but then there's something more semantic in the background. Okay, I understand. Okay, good. All right, thank you. Thank you for that. I don't have any further questions. It's not really my role today, so thank you very much, Eugenia. It was a very nice talk. Thank you for all the work that you've done over the years.
Okay, so thank you all. I think we have everything to discuss in a private session, perhaps.
Yeah, and how, by the way, it's gonna work? Am I disconnecting from the meeting? Sorry, I just don't know. Or I leave from the room. How do you know?
Yeah, so my understanding is that I stay, but I'm not involved. I don't debate. I don't write the report. This is the information that the ENS sent me, but I'm just sort of there as I sit in the room virtually.
I think we need a private.
I cannot enter. It's okay.
Yeah, completely, but
Hello.
hello, Eugenia.
Hello.
Eugenia, you're here, right, Ra? Okay.
I can't
Yes.
see it yet, Eugenia.
Just a second. It's loading my webcam. Oh, start sharing. Oh no, it's the wrong webcam. Just a second. I need to start. I have two webcams, so it's all complicated. Let me. Sorry for this little interruption. I will. Hello. Camera. Just a second. It should be good. Okay. Hello. Hello. I'm back.
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Okay, so the jury has a deliberation, and we are really very happy to congratulate you for the presentation you give of your very nice PhD thesis work. Your presentation was very mature. You demonstrated a lot of expertise and confidence and mastery in the area you presented. We have been very impressed by the wide range of aspects with which that you showed us, and especially making links between theory and applications. And you found the right level of presentation, especially in your oral presentation today. And so for all these reasons, we are really very happy and congratulate you to deliver the PhD thesis diploma from ENS. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much to my thesis director, to Ras, of course, without whom it would not be possible, for his support, for all the ideas we had together, for all the working hours we spent at the whiteboard, and I'm really grateful for that. And also, it was great working in LEAP. And of course, I wanted to say thank you to all my friends, to my family that always supported me, and I'm really happy. And thank you also, jury, for coming and for being here. Thank you, the reporters that read and wrote a report. I'm really grateful for you, and thank you very much.
Yeah, good luck in the future as well. Are you staying? Yeah. Are you staying on in Lyon, or are you moving somewhere else?
Yes, actually, I already moved. So I started a new job I started an engineering position in a project, in a big Swiss European project, this Blue Brain project for studying brain. And I started a new engineering position as a knowledge engineer. So I will be working with knowledge graphs. I will be using graph transformations. I will be doing things I was doing here, but more, let's say, in industrial settings. I mean, it's a research project, but it's a very large knowledge graph, and I will try to apply my expertise there.
Where is it based?
It's in Geneva.
Geneva, oh, very nice.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a very good news. It's a good challenge for your thesis to apply it. That's very interesting. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was great.
Great.
I'm also very happy.
All the best.
Thank you. I'm also happy that everything went well technically. I was very worried because I had broadcast and this.
It's the beginning there. So anyhow, Russ helped me out. Just needed a little bit of guidance.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Okay, so I disconnect. Unfortunately, we cannot make some nice buffet and celebrate it.
I was saying that at some point.
Next time, maybe at some point you all come here and